Have you ever said yes to something you didn't want to do just because saying no felt uncomfortable? Maybe it seemed like a small thing. But sometimes, small moments like this teach people more about you than you realize. People are constantly learning from your reactions. They notice what makes you uncomfortable, what you tolerate, how quickly you give in, and whether your boundaries actually change your behavior. This doesn't mean everyone around you is secretly manipulating you. But whenever someone discovers that pushing a little gets them what they want, they receive information. And that information can change the relationship. The real problem begins when a person learns that your words say one thing, but your actions communicate something completely different. That's when a boundary stops being a boundary and becomes a negotiation. A boundary is not a command telling another person how they must behave. You cannot control someone else's choices. A boundary is a decision about what you will accept and what you will do when that limit is crossed. For example, telling someone they are not allowed to interrupt you is an attempt to control their behavior. Deciding that you will end the conversation when you're repeatedly interrupted is a boundary you can actually enforce. This distinction matters because people quickly notice the difference between a boundary that exists only in words and one that consistently changes what happens next. And this is where boundary testing becomes interesting. Someone doesn't necessarily need to ask, "What can I get away with?" Their behavior may simply reveal the answer as they watch what happens after each small violation. One reason people test boundaries is simple human behavior. We learn through feedback. When an action produces a reward, people are naturally more likely to repeat that action. This doesn't automatically make the other person bad. Sometimes they may simply misunderstand your limits because you've never clearly communicated them, but repeated testing after clear communication is much more revealing. This doesn't automatically make the other person bad. Sometimes they may simply misunderstand your limits because you've never clearly communicated them. But repeated testing after clear communication is much more revealing. That's why you shouldn't judge a relationship from one uncomfortable moment. Look for the pattern. What happens when you say no? What happens when you become less available? What happens when you stop making things easy for them? One of the easiest boundaries to test is your availability. Someone may start by asking for a small amount of your time, then gradually behave as though your time is automatically available whenever they need it. The important part isn't the first request. It's what happens when you become unavailable. A respectful person adjusts. Someone who feels entitled may pressure you, complain, repeatedly ask, or make you feel responsible for their disappointment. This is why being constantly available can create an unexpected problem. People may stop seeing your availability as generosity and start seeing it as the normal price of having access to you. Your no is one of the clearest pieces of information you can give someone. But the real test often begins after the word is spoken. Does the person accept it or immediately begin looking for a way around it? Some people don't challenge your boundary directly. Instead, they change the emotional meaning of your decision. Suddenly, your no becomes selfishness, your privacy becomes secrecy, and your need for space becomes rejection. This is where you need to separate someone's emotional reaction from your responsibility. You can care about how someone feels without accepting responsibility for making every decision they dislike feel comfortable. Guilt can be one of the most effective forms of pressure because it doesn't force you physically. It makes you question yourself until you voluntarily give up the boundary you were trying to protect. You start thinking, maybe I'm being difficult, maybe I'm overreacting, maybe I should just do it this once. And that final thought is often where the pattern becomes stronger, because the lesson isn't only what the other person learns, you're learning too. Every time you abandon your own boundary to avoid discomfort, your brain becomes more comfortable repeating that decision. Boundary testing often happens gradually. A person doesn't need to cross your biggest boundary on the first day. They may start with something tiny, observe your response, and slowly increase what they expect from you. This is why individual incidents can be misleading. One interruption may be accidental, one forgotten request may be genuine. But when the same behavior continues after you've clearly addressed it, the pattern deserves attention. The goal isn't to become suspicious of everyone. It's to become better at recognizing patterns. Healthy relationships don't require you to constantly defend basic limits. Some boundaries become harder to defend when other people are watching. A request that would be easy to refuse privately can suddenly feel much harder when saying no might make you look rude, difficult, or antisocial. This creates a powerful conflict inside your mind. One part of you wants to protect your boundary, another part wants to avoid embarrassment, and sometimes people rely on that hesitation because they know social pressure can weaken your response. The solution isn't becoming aggressive. In fact, Calmness can make your boundary stronger. You don't need to prove that you're angry. You simply need to make your decision clear and remain consistent with it. One of the most confusing moments happens when you finally enforce a boundary after tolerating something for a long time. The other person may suddenly act surprised, offended, or confused by your change in behavior. But here's the important distinction. Just because someone became accustomed to your lack of boundaries doesn't mean they were entitled to it. You're allowed to change your mind. You're allowed to become less available. You're allowed to stop explaining yourself endlessly. And you're allowed to decide that something you tolerated before no longer belongs in your life. The most revealing moment isn't when someone crosses your boundary. It's what they do after they know they've crossed it. That's when you can begin to understand whether you're dealing with a mistake, a misunderstanding, or a pattern of entitlement. A healthy response may involve adjustment, respect, or even a simple acknowledgement that they went too far. An unhealthy response often involves denial, blame, pressure, retaliation, or immediately testing the same boundary again. So what should you actually do when you recognize the pattern? Start by slowing down. Don't immediately accuse someone of manipulating you. First, identify exactly what behavior is making you uncomfortable. Then make the boundary specific. Instead of expecting someone to somehow know what bothers you, define what you will and won't participate in. The clearer the boundary, the easier it becomes to recognize when it has been crossed. After that, stop over-explaining. A boundary doesn't become more legitimate because you provide 10 reasons for it. Sometimes, the more you explain, the more material you give someone to argue against. And finally, watch behavior instead of promises. Someone can agree with your boundary today and ignore it tomorrow. What matters most is the pattern you see over time. This is the part many people miss. Strong boundaries don't necessarily make people respect you more immediately. Sometimes they reveal who only respected you when you were easy to deal with. And that can feel uncomfortable, because when you start protecting your time, energy, privacy, and attention, some relationships may change. But change isn't always a sign that something went wrong. Sometimes the boundary didn't destroy the relationship. It simply revealed the relationship more honestly. The people who respect your limits can adapt. The people who depended on you having no limits may resist them. So don't judge people only by how they treat you when everything goes their way. Watch what happens when you say no, protect your time, ask for space, or stop giving them unlimited access, because that's often when someone's true level of respect becomes visible. And if you've ever wondered what disrespect actually looks like before it becomes impossible to ignore, the next video will show you the signs you should never normalize.